have a talk by Catherine Rees. It's a joint talk with Matthew Jones, who can't be here, so she's going to do it on her Todd. Catherine has worked in commercial archaeology since 2002. In 2007, she relocated from South Wales to North Wales and has worked extensively on Anglesey, where we went, our most recent summer meeting was in Anglesey, and also Gwynedd and Conwy. She's particularly interested in the Neolithic period, and she is the joint founder with Matthew Jones of CR Archaeology. And tonight, her talk is going to be our prehistoric discoveries at Llanfaethlu. Let's pronounce it right. I've got it right. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for coming. And the opening slide is just a couple of Matt, my absent partner, is there with the axe. And then there's Vicky and Chris, who were sort of two of the main digging team. I feel that digging teams don't ever get enough of a shout out on these things, so some faces rather than backs of heads. Now, this next slide is just to orientate everybody as to where the site is. So we're right up on the northwest coast of Anglesey, and you can see from the aerial photograph, you've got the sea in the background. There's a little medieval church, and if you look at the inset photo, you can see we're down on a slope. And this site was dug as a commercial site, so it wasn't chosen because we knew there was something there. It was chosen because we knew that there was quite a high potential for archaeology to come up. And so in the photograph, you could see sort of the various phases of the work. So the brown lines are where our evaluation trenches went. And of our 20 evaluation trenches, only one really hit anything particularly interesting, but it was very, very interesting, and it went straight across one of the houses and one of the pit groups. And so this is the site then later on, and I've included the whole site plan, but when you look at the photographs, it might be a bit difficult to orientate yourself because the site, as I say, was dug in phases. So we started off with trenches, then we extended one of the trenches, and then we extended it again. And so we had one early Neolithic house. In the area, you could see house 2, pit group 1, house 3. That was where our trench went through that. So we, knowing that the houses in North Wales are sort of 15 metres in length tops, the trench was extended to 40 metres by 40 metres, centred on the feature that we had. And we discovered that we didn't have one house, we had 3. So this is the first multi-house site that we've had in North Wales, and we discovered that it extended outside of the area that we'd dug, so the trench got extended again. And then later on then, because it's a commercial job, the rest of the development area was then stripped down. So the photograph that is underlying it is when we had the original 40 by 40 metre trench open. And then there's the list then of all the archaeological features that came up in the process of the work. And in the interest of keeping this talk to about 40 minutes, I'm not going to go into any great detail on the burnt mound or the curvilinear features and outlying pits because they're still quite a mix of dates and they're not necessarily forming an entirely coherent story beyond being outlying features to the main concentration. So I'm going to gloss over those slightly. Now this is the first, the earliest of the features on site, and this is what we were able to later date as a Mesolithic tree throw. So when it was initially stripped, there was a very, very clear concentration of flints. So the area was taken down, troweled down, all of the flints positions were noted, and then lifted individually, and then once the top layer had come off, we could see that underneath there were these undulations, which is where there's been a tree that's gone over at a later date. And within the tree throw, you can just see down the bottom, there's some human teeth. And I don't know how familiar people are with Welsh archaeology, but the soils are very acidic. And so it's very unusual on an open air site to get any survival of human remains or bone at all. It doesn't normally survive. So this was a very, very exciting find. And as far as I know, this is the only Mesolithic human remains that we have in Wales that haven't come from a cave site. So again, it's kind of showing us this entirely different way of depositing the dead, and within this natural feature. And then you can see where Vicky is down the bottom there, there's the remains of a very sort of shallow hearth. So there's a lot of returning to this area over a very long period of time. It's almost like a kind of a cache. And we do have some bits of the flints that do refit. And then there's just an illustration there of these are the microliths, which are characteristically Neolithic flint that have all come out of that tree throw feature. And you can, if you sort of look at the table, the sheer numbers of flint that we have from the site is incredibly high. And again, to have stratified deposits as well is really, really important for Wales. And then at the top, the radiocarbon dates from that feature, and you can see they seem to fall into two groups. I've got to do more work on just sort of Bayesian modelling with those to see whether or not there's different phases of activity or whether it's possible. But they're all short life samples, so they're all from hazelnut shells, so there's not a tremendous error on it. And we're just currently waiting. Unfortunately, the human remains, there wasn't enough collagen surviving in them for radiocarbon dating directly on the human remains, but the lab in Bristol are seeing whether they can date the enamel, which won't be as accurate, but it'll give us an indication of the date. So hopefully we can kind of tie it in really neatly with that. And then this is just this is a selection of photos that my poor children get forced to pose for every time we go past anything that vaguely resembles a tree throw, and that I get excited about. But I just sort of want to kind of emphasize that the hole and the hollow there over such a long period of time, it's not necessarily a dead feature. It's not necessarily that the tree is down and it's dead. You know, they create these hollows underneath them, and the trees continue living for a long, long time. And then you can see this one is in the forest up by me, and people actually been building up against it to make a little shelter. Or this one as well, with kind of, you know, you get these openings in trees that you can sort of put things in, and then they become a place and repeatedly return to. So they've quite a dynamic environment over time. And then, yeah, this is just from the golf course in Betws-y-Coed. This sign makes me laugh every time I go there, like this kind of tree just reclaiming it. And then this bottom one, my mum took that, and I think it looks like a sheep. But again, it's like this idea that these places, you know, they can look like other things. They can become these markers in quite unusual ways, and then sort of through reinforced use of place. So I've just included those to kind of make it a bit less of a hole in the ground and a little bit more of a this is where the thinking is on it. And then this next slide now is moving forward into the Neolithic period, but there does seem to be a gap between when we've got the Mesolithic occupation and when we start again in the Neolithic, although we have an interesting scatter of radiocarbon dates that seem to be residual in other features. So the site doesn't necessarily seem to have been completely abandoned, but they're not in actual features of that period. But this is showing the group of 3 of the 4 houses that were excavated together. And frustratingly, as you can see, 2 out of 3 of them were outside of the main excavation area. But just to sort of give you an idea of the scale of the structures. And again, just to give a little bit more context to how these structures appeared and how we interpret them, I've taken some reconstructions from different sites with different interpretations, and I particularly like the middle one at the bottom with the idea of whether or not it was entirely roofed, because with house 1 we have that very same question: was one end of it actually unroofed, because we don't have the aisle posts like we do for the rest of it. And then the timber hall at Park Cubby is very close. It's just over on Holy Island, so it's on Anglesey, on the northwest of Anglesey as well. So it's not a massive distance away, but it's smaller than ours. And so this is the first of the houses. This is house 1. And I've just included a selection of photographs to show the different construction techniques, because we've got, there's 2 phases to this structure, and it seems to have burnt down, or the front portion of it seems to have burnt down and then been rebuilt later on. And it's quite a contrast between, so in this area here, it's much more ephemeral. That's the stake holes you can see here. Whereas at this end, this is these very large stone-lined post holes. And then at the rear end of the house, again, it's much lighter weight post holes. And there does seem to have been like this particular emphasis on the part of this structure that faces towards the other houses. And I'll talk a little bit more about the finds when I discuss everything together at the end. And this slide is just sort of showing that the different phases of the house. Sorry, I didn't put the translation, but anyway, there's A and B. So A is the earlier phase, and this is the area. Which way around have I got it? Yeah, sorry. Which way around I've put this? Yeah, so there's this area at the top here with these sort of very small post holes and much smaller wall slot. And then when the house burns down, or part of the house burns down, we see the wall gets rebuilt with a large wall slot with lots of stone-lined post holes in it. And then this wall slot is enlarged as well. So the house actually gets smaller between the 2 phases. But it still remains to the question as to whether or not the area that is no longer enclosed, whether that was ever roofed. And that this is house 2. So you can see it's a completely different sort of construction style, these much larger post holes, and we've got the internal divisions defined by a wall slot rather than the external divisions. And then there's a really interesting, you can see this post hole here, and it's just here on the plan. It's not part of the house circuit. It's a very large sort of a marker post or something. And then there's these 2 smaller, again, stone-lined post holes just off here. So it's sort of some sort of external structure. And it's an interesting idea to sort of think as to whether or not there was some sort of large standing marker post associated with the houses. And they have found similar things in Scotland. And this little room here is only about 2 meters by 2 meters. And I mean, it's one of those things that you can interpret it in a really ritual way, and it's a little shrine, or it's a storage area, but there are other examples of them. There's one from England, and there's some as well from Ireland that have been found with this same little division internally. And then you can see from the top then the features in green. They are middle Neolithic pits, and they actually dig out some of the post holes from the house, and they're reused in a later phase. And then this is the smallest of the houses. This is much more classically what we would expect to find in North Wales, so it's more similar to the one at Park Cubby and the ones at Llanfaethlu as well. So you've got the internal divisions. It's about, I think this one's just over 12 meters long. And this one's interesting in that it's got, you can see this area of burning here, which is a possible hearth, which we don't have in the other houses. The evidence of burning in the other houses is within the wall slots. The other house, sorry, is within the wall slot. And then we had this curious, sort of quite amorphous feature within the compartment at the top of the house. And within this, then we got a leaf-shaped arrowhead and pieces of grey fluid axe that had been broken up and deposited within that little feature. The arrowhead's never been used, but it was burnt. And then I've just included some of the sort of Irish seaware or carionated bowl pottery, and we found that in all of the Neolithic houses. And then finally, this, frustratingly, probably most of this structure lay outside of the development area. As you can see, Vicky's working away as the site's being cleared. And to the other side of it, the ground drops away and there's a farm track, so it's very unlikely that there's a huge amount more of that house surviving outside of the development area, though it would be very interesting to go back and have a look. But I've included this photograph with somebody in it rather than a finished photograph of the site, because just to emphasize the massive, massive scale of these stone-lined post holes and wall slots. And I'll come back to a reconstruction of that one in a few slides. But also, I wanted to draw your attention to, we've had the radiocarbon dates back, because one of the big questions that we had about this site was whether or not all the structures were contemporary, because it's a very different interpretation if you've kind of got like a pioneer structure and then it goes out of use and then another house is built in another house. Our dates are this really tight grouping, and all four structures are in use at the same time and they go out of use at the same time as well. And there's multiple dates for each site. I've just combined them just for ease of interpretation. There is more work to be done with statistical modelling, and Dr. Sarah Griffiths is helping us, and we're kind of working through that to see if we can refine things further and possibly pull out phases. But there was a similar, very, very similar dates. I've included the work of Dr. Jane Kenny at the bottom. Jane dug at Park Brinkegin in Llanfaethlu and Park Cubby in Holyhead, and her date ranges are very, very similar to what we have in this house horizon, where you get the Neolithic houses. They come into use. We originally thought sort of around, kind of 4,000, but as the modelling and the radiocarbon dating has got better and better, and the areas have got smaller and smaller, this window of time that we think the houses are in use for has just shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And now they are sort of starting around 3,800 to about 3,600. So, and I think it'll probably tighten again. So it's only a few generations, if that the structures are in use for. But as we can see from the other features that we have on the sites don't go out of use. And there's still people visiting, they're still depositing things, and quite often the same things. So we are still finding grain, we are still finding pottery, we are finding axe material. We just aren't finding anything like this sort of scale of structures. And then Jane's also done some modelling for Scotland and Ireland. And Ireland has got the sort of closest parallels for the multi-house sites that we have. And again, they're still this really sort of tight grouping of structures, and ours just, they're not the earliest, they're not the latest, they're not, there's nothing that particularly stands out, but it's that kind of just continuously adding the information to it and sort of reinforcing the findings that we have. And so this is just to sort of show you another similar example. These are a few sites that have been excavated in Ireland that are very, very similar to what we have with the external post holes and then the internal slots. And they've been interpreted as sort of having a second floor on them. And the use of it for grain storage, I will come back to when I talk about the environmental finds from the site. But again, the Irish sites, the assemblages are almost identical to what we have. It's the same types of pottery, the same artifacts, and also the same eco-facts. This is a slightly curious feature in that, frustratingly, we don't have reliable dates for it due to the problem with not being able to date the human bone because of the lack of survival of collagen. But this is where we had what would have been a crouched burial, but only a few teeth survived within the grave. And there's a pit that we thought was paired with it, and then there was large amount of early Neolithic pottery in the pit alongside it. But we did try radiocarbon dating. There was some grain and some hazelnuts from the fill, so we thought we'd see what sort of dates they came out at. But one came back as modern, and the other two came back as either end of the Iron Age. So we're not hugely any more enlightened as to there is Iron Age activity in the vicinity, and it wouldn't be entirely out of keeping for the Iron Age people to just have randomly buried somebody on a much earlier site, but we just can't conclusively give any real sort of date. So we're really hoping that they'll be able to date the enamel to give us a rough idea. And then there's the teeth at the top there, and Professor Rick Sholton is currently doing isotopic work on the teeth from this feature and from the tree throw. And preliminary work, it looks like they were both local to that area of the island. But we haven't had the dietary work back yet to see whether or not there's any differences between them. And then hopefully, if we can tie that in again with a solid, if slightly vague date. This is pit group 1, which was the middle Neolithic pit group, which is the one that runs through houses 2 and 3. And so this is how it looked when we were doing the evaluation trenching. So you can see we had a 2 meter by 20 meter trench. We extended it out to be 6 meters by 10 meters, at which point it was pretty clear that it was extending far, far beyond the trench limits. And then we had some really nice hearths as part of this assemblage. And then you can see where Vicky's excavating down in the corner there, this really distinctive Mortlake Middle Neolithic pottery. But rather than like the early Neolithic pottery, which is just kind of in post holes and in features, but it doesn't seem to have been particularly placed, we had a number of pits where the pottery seems to have been deliberately pressed around the edges of the features. And then there's the radiocarbon dates from this group, which again are a really nice tight grouping. It looks like it's in use over a relatively short period of time. And one of the interesting things that we did have from this pit group is that when Francis Lynch, the pottery expert, went through, we had sherds from the same pot in different features. So you could match the sherds from adjoining features. They're from the same pot. So again, it would reinforce the idea that it's a relatively short-lived thing if they've got the pits open at the same time to put the sherds from the same pots into the different features. Yeah, I think that's it. Now this is the second, slightly later group of pits. And you can see that these are much, much larger pits. These are associated with grooved ware. So sort of a couple of 100 years later, maybe. And the really interesting thing that we had with these is that we had the deposition of artifacts that were complete. So we had the two stone axes, and then there's an adze. And like with the pottery, the two pieces of the adze were from two different post holes, two different pits, sorry. And we had some absolutely beautiful denticulated flint, so you can see up at the top there. And this flint that they're using in this period has been imported either from the north of England or possibly sort of over the Wessex area, because in this part of Wales, the only flint that's available locally is beach flint, so it's just the pebbles that come off the beach, and so it doesn't really lend itself to making particularly fancy artifacts, but this stuff is sort of really beautiful, kind of glassy flint. And again, we've got the very nice tight group of radiocarbon dates. We did have some intercutting features from this phase, which we didn't really see in the previous phase, but there doesn't necessarily seem to have been much more longevity. But again, it's just this sort of reinforcing and this kind of repeated use of the site. They're coming back again and again and again. And I just... Oh. Hang on. Sorry. I just wanted to sort of include this slide just to sort of show how many people are involved after we come off-site and all the various sort of skills that are going into this. So, and just a massive shout out to Matt, who's looking very happy with the blue bags there. One of the things that we had on the site was 100% sampling strategy, and Matt sieved every single one of those bags. So yeah, I think that's just an achievement in itself. You could see them from space on Google Earth at one point. And then, yeah, there's Ynys and Karen who did the environmental work, Adam at Aerial-Cam, there's Rick who's doing the isotopic work, Tim doing the radiocarbon dating, Jana at the museum did the stone sources for the axes, development control officer, who's absolutely instrumental in just because of it being a commercial job, making sure that the design of the excavation strategy and the post-excavation strategy, everything goes through Jenny. And then there's the wonderful Francis Lynch, and you can just see Jane Kenny behind, who are the experts on houses in Northwest Wales. And that's a picture of them out at the site. And they've, again, we've had lots and lots of discussions about the houses. Sarah, who's helping me with the radiocarbon dates and the Bayesian analysis. And then Bristol with Lily and Judy. It's lipid analysis, animal bone, and then Jessica again with the lipids. So I just kind of, and Ian, the flint and stone expert. So just to kind of reinforce that this isn't just what happens on the site. There's so much more that goes on afterwards, and all of these people that you generally don't hear about, but that I think just deserve to kind of be talked about. And this is the work of Dr. Hannah Russ then, from our 100% sampling. This is our entire animal bone assemblage. And although the total numbers might look quite impressive, this entire animal bone assemblage fitted within a child's shoebox. It's that poor, the preservation, and if we hadn't have sieved, then I'm not entirely sure we would have got anything much. But from what we did get, it's really, really interesting. So we've got the roe deer, which that came from House 1, and we had one of the features within House 1 was a post hole. And at the start, we had, the post hole was burnt, and we had deer stragglers placed in it. And then on top of the deer stragglers, we had the quern stone, and then the stone packing for a post. And then when the post was removed, it was the only post hole that was backfilled, and it was backfilled with stone, and then there was a beautiful green sort of beach stone within the sort of backfilling of that pit. So it was really interesting. We didn't have anything else that was identifiably roe deer from anywhere else on the site either. They are all from that one feature. And then the other thing that's really interesting about this is to have the horn core, because I'll talk in a minute about the dairying at the site, but it's generally would have been assumed that the dairying at the site would be cattle. But if you look at the sizes of the animals represented, it's almost certain that we don't really have cattle at the site. We have pig and we have sheep, goat. They can't tell the difference between the two. So again, it's really interesting to sort of think about the animal husbandry at the site and how all of the different sort of specialist reports all come together. And then this is the lipid analysis, because previously we could identify there were animals the size of pigs, but we couldn't confirm that they were pigs until we did the lipid analysis. And so the pig fat came from the early Neolithic. And it was very interesting because we had one bowl that seems to have only been used for processing of pig meat, whereas the other ones were either sort of mixed or predominantly dairy. And then the second really interesting thing that we had was we had evidence of either beeswax or honey being used in one of the vessels, and this is the earliest example of this that we have from Wales, and this is from one of the groovesware pots. So we don't know whether or not it was honey as part of a diet or whether beeswax was being used as a sealant. But again, it's just sort of this building and building and building on the information that we have on what was available. And the final section then, which was really interesting, was looking at the sort of, there's a much, much higher incidence of vessels that were used solely for dairy products in the early Neolithic, so the house phase of the site, which then drops in the later pit periods, and then it's about the same between the Mortlake and the Groovesware pits. So yeah, and again, this ties in really nicely with the same group of scientists analysed pottery from Park Cubby, which is over near Bangor on the main, Llanfaethlu, which is over near Bangor on the mainland of North Wales, and Park Cubby, which is near Holyhead, and the very, very similar results to what we have from the site. So again, it's the similar activities going on at similar sites. And I've realised that one other thing that was quite interesting with having the animal remains is if you look at the distribution of the animal remains, it does seem to be quite skewed towards House 1, and that was the area where we thought there may be possibly like a pen. So it does suggest that it's possible that the structures had different uses or maybe different emphasis. And again, this is the final slide then. And just to show you the sorts of material that we were getting from Llanfaethlu, because with the 100% sampling, we're able to get a really good idea of the plants that are being exploited. And I mean, hazelnut shells dominate all of the assemblages right the way through, from the Mesolithic assemblage right the way through into the grooveware assemblages. And we also had, most of it was wheat, but we also had emmet and barley at the site in the house phases. And also we have sort of wild plants, so crab apples, sloe, hawthorn, and there's a few wetland taxa, so sedges, and then some plants sort of representative of coastal vegetation. So again, sort of not that dissimilar to what we have now, but there was a sizable assemblage of emmer wheat particularly, and then in smaller quantities barley and spelt within the houses. And then I'll just read you the quote because they put it a bit better than me. Cereal chaff and cereal grain are more likely to be found abundantly together in House 4 contexts. This patterning suggests the high abundance of cereal finds in House 4 is likely to represent the storage and or high likelihood of deposition of cereals in this context, as opposed to a purely temporal pattern. So again, sort of reinforcing this idea of different houses maybe having slightly different functions, and if it is maybe a granary, like in the Irish interpretation with the separate floor, then it does seem to be concentrated on House 4, and House 4 has much, much more grain. And considering, if you sort of remember back, we only excavated less than half of House 4, for it to stand out so much even without being fully excavated does hint at a possibility of storage use. And I think they had the same in Balbride, didn't they? Sort of a lot of grain within the structure. And yeah, there is grain within the later Neolithic pits, but not in the same quantities as we find within the houses. So there is still some agriculture going on, but either it's not as intensive or it's just simply not being stored there. And that's the difference that we're seeing, rather than there being a difference in the land use. But right the way through, there's continued exploitation of wild resources. And again, this ties in really well with the stuff from other similar sites. And thank you very much. I think I've gone through that much faster than I intended. And this is just a list of everybody who's been involved in the programme.